The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble corridors of Valdoria Palace as Prince Alexander made his way through the eastern wing. The heir to the throne of Valdoria had always been known for his composed demeanor, but today something was different. His jaw was set with determination, and his blue eyes held a storm that palace servants had learned to recognize as trouble brewing. Alexander had spent a sleepless night wrestling with what he had witnessed the previous evening. The memory played over and over in his mind like a haunting melody he couldn't shake. His 8-year-old daughter, Princess Isabella, had come running to him in tears, her small frame shaking with sobs that broke his heart into pieces. The palace had been buzzing with the usual evening activities when Isabella had sought refuge in the library, one of her favorite quiet spaces. What she encountered there would change the dynamics of the royal family forever. Marcus Thornfield, the eldest son of Queen Consort Elena from her previous marriage, had cornered the young princess in the secluded corner where she liked to read her fairy tales. Marcus, at 25, had always been a source of tension within the royal household. His integration into the family when his mother married King Edward had been rocky from the start. Unlike Alexander, who had grown up with royal protocol and understood the weight of responsibility that came with the crown, Marcus seemed to relish in pushing boundaries and testing limits. The servants whispered about his behavior, though never loud enough for the king or queen consort to hear. They spoke of his drinking, his late-night escapades, and his general disrespect for palace traditions. But what happened in the library crossed every line imaginable. Isabella had been sitting quietly with her favorite book of princess stories when Marcus entered, already showing signs of having consumed too much wine at dinner. His words were slurred, but his intentions were clear and disturbing. He approached the innocent child with inappropriate comments that no 8-year-old should ever hear. "Pretty little princess," he had said, his voice thick with alcohol. "You're going to be quite beautiful when you grow up, just like your grandmother was." His words carried implications that made Isabella uncomfortable, though she didn't fully understand why. When Isabella tried to leave, Marcus blocked her path. "Where are you going, little one? Don't you want to play a special game with your big brother?" The term big brother felt wrong coming from his lips, twisted into something that made Isabella's stomach turn. The young princess, wise beyond her years due to her royal upbringing, sensed danger. "I want to go to Papa," she said firmly, trying to step around Marcus. But he grabbed her small wrist, his grip tighter than necessary. "Not yet, sweet Isabella. First, we need to have a little talk about keeping secrets. Royal families are very good at keeping secrets, aren't they?" His smile was predatory, and Isabella felt fear creep up her spine like ice-cold fingers. It was at this moment that Sir James Whitmore, one of the palace's most trusted guards, happened to be making his evening rounds. The library was typically empty at this hour, but he noticed the lights were still on. When he peered through the slightly open door, what he saw made his blood run cold. Marcus had positioned himself uncomfortably close to Isabella, who was pressed against the bookshelf with tears streaming down her face. The guard could hear Marcus speaking in low, inappropriate tones, making comments about Isabella's appearance and asking her to keep their special friendship a secret. Sir James had served the royal family for over 15 years. He had protected them through political scandals, assassination attempts, and public relations nightmares. But nothing in his extensive training had prepared him for witnessing what appeared to be the beginning of something unspeakably wrong happening to the innocent princess he had watched grow from a toddler. Without hesitation, Sir James cleared his throat loudly and entered the library. "Your Highness," he addressed Isabella with gentle formality, "your father has been looking for you. He's waiting in his study for your goodnight kiss." Marcus straightened immediately, his face flushing with anger at the interruption. "We were just having a conversation, guard. You may leave us." But Sir James had not risen to his position by backing down from uncomfortable situations. "I'm afraid His Royal Highness Prince Alexander specifically requested that Princess Isabella come immediately. Royal protocol must be followed." The standoff lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like hours. Marcus's eyes narrowed with barely contained rage, while Sir James maintained his professional composure despite the fury burning in his chest. Isabella took the opportunity to slip past Marcus and run to the safety of the guard's side. "Thank you, Sir James," she whispered, her voice still shaky from fear. As they walked toward Alexander's study, Isabella's small hand gripped the guard's sleeve. "Sir James," she said quietly, "Marcus said we have a special secret, but it didn't feel like a good secret. Mama always taught me that good secrets are happy, like surprise parties. This didn't feel happy." Sir James knelt to Isabella's eye level, his heart breaking at the wisdom and confusion in her young face. "Your Highness, you're absolutely right. There are good secrets and bad secrets. What happened back there was not a good secret. And, you know what? The best thing to do with bad secrets is to tell someone you trust about them." "Like Papa?" Isabella asked hopefully. "Exactly like Papa," Sir James confirmed. When they reached Alexander's study, the prince immediately noticed his daughter's distressed state. Her usually perfectly braided hair was disheveled, her dress was wrinkled, and her eyes were red from crying. But what concerned him most was the way she clung to Sir James as if he were her lifeline. "What happened, my darling?" Alexander asked, lifting Isabella into his arms and settling into his favorite leather chair. Through hiccuped breaths and fresh tears, Isabella recounted her encounter with Marcus. She spoke of his strange words, the way he touched her wrist, and how scared she felt when he blocked her from leaving. Sir James corroborated her account, adding the disturbing details he had witnessed from the doorway. As Isabella spoke, Alexander felt a rage building within him unlike anything he had ever experienced. This was his precious daughter, his innocent little girl who still believed in fairy tales and happy endings. The thought of anyone, especially someone living under their own roof, threatening her safety in any way was absolutely unacceptable. But Alexander was not just a father in that moment, he was the future king of Valdoria. Every decision he made would have consequences that rippled throughout the kingdom. He needed to handle this situation with the wisdom of a ruler and the protective instincts of a parent. After ensuring Isabella was safely tucked into bed with extra guards posted outside her room, Alexander called for an emergency meeting with his most trusted advisors. The group included Sir James, the head of palace security, the royal family's legal counsel, and his personal aide who had served him since childhood. "Gentlemen," Alexander began, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart, "we have a serious situation that requires immediate and decisive action. What I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room until we have determined the best course of action for the safety of Princess Isabella and the stability of the kingdom." He recounted the evening's events in clinical detail, watching as each man's face grew increasingly grave. The legal counsel took extensive notes while the head of security immediately began discussing increased protection measures for Isabella. "Your Highness," the legal counsel said carefully, "these are very serious allegations. If what Princess Isabella and Sir James describe is accurate, we're dealing with attempted assault on a minor, and potentially the beginning of a grooming process. The fact that this involves a member of the royal family makes this extraordinarily sensitive." Alexander nodded grimly. "I'm aware of the implications. But let me be crystal clear about something: my daughter's safety comes before political considerations, family harmony, or public perception. If Marcus poses a threat to Isabella, he will be removed from this palace, regardless of the consequences." The head of security leaned forward. "Sir, we should also consider that if Marcus has been inappropriate with Princess Isabella, there's a possibility this isn't an isolated incident. We may need to investigate whether other children in the palace or kingdom have been at risk." This thought hadn't occurred to Alexander, and it added another layer of urgency to the situation. The palace employed dozens of staff members, many of whom had children who lived on the grounds or visited regularly. The idea that Marcus might have been predatory toward other vulnerable children made Alexander's protective instincts extend beyond just his own daughter. "I want a complete review of any incidents involving Marcus and children," Alexander ordered. "Talk to the staff, review security footage from common areas, and look for any patterns of inappropriate behavior. I also want Isabella to speak with the royal family's private counselor tomorrow. She needs professional support to process what happened and to ensure she understands that none of this was her fault." As the meeting continued into the early hours of the morning, a comprehensive plan began to take shape. They would need to approach King Edward about his stepson's behavior, but they would need irrefutable evidence and a clear recommendation for action. They would also need to consider how to handle Queen Consort Elena, who was fiercely protective of her son despite his flaws. Sir James, who had remained quietly observant throughout most of the meeting, finally spoke up. "Your Highness, if I may. In my 15 years of service to this family, I have never seen anything that concerned me more than what I witnessed tonight. Princess Isabella is a brave, intelligent child, but she was genuinely frightened. Whatever course of action we take, it needs to send a clear message that this behavior will never be tolerated again." Alexander looked at each man around the table, seeing his own determination reflected in their faces. These were men who had dedicated their lives to protecting the royal family, and they understood that Isabella's safety was paramount. "Then, we're in agreement," Alexander said firmly. "Tomorrow, I will speak with my father about removing Marcus from the palace permanently. I don't care if it causes a scandal or upsets Elena. My daughter will not live in fear in her own home." As the meeting concluded and the men filed out to begin their respective tasks, Alexander remained in his study, staring out at the palace gardens where Isabella loved to play. The morning sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in soft pastels that reminded him of his daughter's favorite dress. He thought about all the times he had watched Isabella run through those gardens, her laughter echoing off the palace walls. She was the light of his life, the reason he worked so hard to be worthy of the crown he would someday wear. The idea that someone had tried to steal even a moment of her innocence filled him with a protective fury that would drive every decision he made in the coming days. Alexander knew that the confrontation with Marcus was inevitable. But he also knew that when it came, he would be ready to do whatever was necessary to protect his daughter and ensure that justice was served, even if it meant tearing the royal family apart in the process. The grand throne room of Valdoria Palace had witnessed centuries of royal declarations, diplomatic negotiations, and family disputes, but never had its ornate walls been prepared for the confrontation that was about to unfold. Alexander stood before the massive oak doors, his hands steady despite the storm of emotions churning within him. Behind those doors waited not only Marcus Thornfield, but also King Edward and Queen Consort Elena, summoned for what Alexander had diplomatically termed an urgent family matter requiring immediate resolution. The previous night had been spent in careful preparation. Alexander's legal counsel had worked through the dawn hours, documenting every detail of the incident and researching the legal precedents for removing a royal family member from the palace. Sir James had provided a formal written statement of his observations, while the palace's child psychologist had conducted a gentle but thorough interview with Isabella to ensure her account was accurately recorded and her emotional well-being protected. Dr. Margaret Healy, the kingdom's most respected child psychologist and a trusted confidant of the royal family, had approached the sensitive interview with the utmost care. Isabella, initially hesitant to relive the frightening experience, gradually opened up in the safe, comfortable environment of the palace's private family room. "Princess Isabella," Dr. Healy had said gently, "I want you to know that you are incredibly brave for telling your papa what happened. Sometimes grown-ups don't behave the way they should, and it's never a child's fault when that happens." Isabella, clutching her favorite stuffed unicorn, had nodded solemnly. "Marcus made me feel scared in my tummy. Like when I have bad dreams, but I was awake." The psychologist carefully guided Isabella through her recollection, using age-appropriate language and ensuring the young princess understood that she had done nothing wrong. What emerged from the interview was a disturbing pattern of boundary violations that had apparently been escalating over several weeks. Isabella revealed that Marcus had been making inappropriate comments about her appearance during family dinners, often when the adults weren't paying attention. He had also begun seeking her out for private conversations, during which he would tell her she was special and different from other little girls. Most troubling of all, he had started suggesting that their interactions should remain secret because other people might not understand their special friendship. Dr. Healy's professional assessment was clear and damning. Marcus's behavior exhibited classic grooming patterns, and, without immediate intervention, the situation would likely escalate to more serious forms of abuse. Her recommendation was unequivocal: Marcus should be immediately removed from any environment where he had access to Isabella or other children. Armed with this professional assessment and the sworn statement from Sir James, Alexander prepared for what he knew would be one of the most difficult conversations of his life. King Edward, now in his 70s, had always prioritized family unity above all else. The marriage to Elena had been as much a political alliance as a romantic union, bringing together two powerful families and strengthening Valdoria's position in regional politics. Elena herself was a formidable woman who had spent years carefully crafting her position within the royal family. Her son Marcus was her pride and joy, despite his obvious flaws, and she had consistently made excuses for his behavior, attributing his problems to the difficulty of adjusting to royal life. When Alexander entered the throne room, the atmosphere was already tense. King Edward sat upon his throne with the weight of his 73 years evident in his posture, while Elena stood nearby, her expression a mixture of defiance and concern. Marcus lounged in one of the ornate chairs with an air of casual indifference that Alexander found particularly infuriating given the circumstances. "Father," Alexander began, his voice carrying the formal tone reserved for official royal business, "I have requested this meeting to address a matter of the utmost seriousness concerning the safety and well-being of Princess Isabella." King Edward's eyebrows raised slightly. Throughout his long reign, he had learned to read his son's moods and recognized the controlled fury beneath Alexander's diplomatic exterior. "Proceed, my son. What matter requires such urgency?" Alexander placed the carefully prepared documentation on the small table beside his father's throne. Yesterday evening, Princess Isabella was subjected to inappropriate and predatory behavior by Marcus Thornfield. This incident was witnessed by Sir James Whitmore and has been corroborated by testimony from Isabella herself, as well as a professional assessment by Dr. Healy. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena's face went through a rapid succession of emotions: shock, denial, and, finally, protective anger. Marcus, for his part, maintained his casual demeanor, though a slight tightening around his eyes suggested he understood the gravity of the situation. "These are very serious accusations, Alexander," King Edward said slowly, his voice heavy with the weight of implications. "I trust you have substantial evidence to support such claims." "I have irrefutable evidence, father." Alexander's voice remained steady as he gestured toward the documents. Sir James witnessed Marcus cornering Isabella in the library, making inappropriate comments about her physical appearance and future development. When Isabella attempted to leave, Marcus physically prevented her from doing so and suggested that their interaction should remain a secret. Elena stepped forward, her composure cracking. "This is preposterous. Marcus would never harm a child. He loves Isabella like a sister. This guard must be mistaken, or perhaps Isabella misunderstood an innocent interaction." But Alexander was prepared for this response. "Queen Consort Elena, with all due respect, Dr. Healy's interview with Isabella has revealed that this was not an isolated incident. Marcus has been engaging in a pattern of grooming behavior for several weeks, including inappropriate comments during family meals and seeking out private conversations with my daughter." Marcus finally spoke, his voice carrying a note of irritated dismissal. "This is all being blown completely out of proportion. I was simply being friendly with the child. If she misinterpreted my intentions, that's hardly my fault." The casualness of Marcus's response ignited something fierce within Alexander. This was his daughter they were discussing, his innocent, trusting daughter who had come to him in tears, seeking protection from someone who was supposed to be family. Misinterpreted? Alexander's voice rose slightly, though he maintained his royal composure. "Marcus, you cornered an 8-year-old child, made inappropriate comments about her body, physically prevented her from leaving, and suggested she keep secrets about your interactions. These are textbook predatory behaviors." King Edward held up a hand, sensing the conversation was about to spiral beyond control. "Alexander, I understand your protective instincts as a father. But we must approach this matter with careful consideration for all parties involved." "Father," Alexander said, turning to face the king directly, "I am approaching this with careful consideration. I have consulted with our legal counsel, obtained professional psychological assessment, and documented every aspect of this incident. My conclusion is not based on emotion, but on facts and expert opinion." He moved closer to his father's throne, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "Isabella is your granddaughter. She is an innocent child who deserves to feel safe in her own home. The professional assessment clearly states that without intervention, Marcus's behavior will likely escalate to more serious forms of abuse." Elena's protective maternal instincts flared. How dare you suggest that my son is capable of such things? Marcus has had difficulties adjusting to royal life, yes, but he would never harm a child. This is clearly a misunderstanding being manipulated by those who have never accepted him as part of this family. Alexander turned to Elena, his patience wearing thin. Queen consort, I have great respect for you and your position in this family. But your son's behavior toward my daughter is unacceptable, regardless of any adjustment difficulties he may be experiencing. Marcus stood abruptly, his casual demeanor finally cracking. I don't have to listen to these accusations. This is clearly a witch hunt designed to remove me from the family because I've never quite fit into your perfect royal mold. You're right about one thing, Marcus, Alexander replied coldly. You don't fit into our royal family. Not because of your background, but because your behavior is incompatible with the values we hold dear, particularly the protection of innocent children. The confrontation was reaching a critical point when Sir James entered the throne room, having been summoned to provide his first-hand account of the incident. The experienced guard's testimony was delivered with military precision, leaving no room for doubt about what he had witnessed. Your Majesty, Sir James addressed King Edward directly, in my 15 years of service to this family, I have never felt compelled to intervene in a situation as I did yesterday evening. What I witnessed was deeply disturbing and, clearly inappropriate behavior toward Princess Isabella. He continued with specific details, Marcus's slurred speech indicating intoxication, his positioning of Isabella against the bookshelf in a manner that prevented her escape, and the clearly predatory nature of his comments about her appearance and future development. Most concerning to me, Sir James concluded, was Marcus's insistence that Isabella keep their interaction secret. In my experience, when adults ask children to keep secrets about their interactions, it is almost always because those interactions are inappropriate. King Edward absorbed this testimony in silence, his weathered face reflecting the internal struggle between his desire for family unity and his responsibility to protect his granddaughter. The weight of the crown had taught him that sometimes the most difficult decisions were also the most necessary. Elena made one final attempt to defend her son. Even if Marcus made some inappropriate comments, surely this matter can be resolved with counseling and supervision. Removing him from the family entirely seems excessive. But Alexander had anticipated this argument as well. Queen consort, the professional assessment specifically recommends immediate removal from any environment where Marcus has access to children. This is not punishment, it's protection. Isabella's safety cannot be compromised by half measures. He turned back to his father with renewed determination. Father, I am not asking for your permission. I am informing you of my decision as Isabella's father and, as the heir to this throne. Marcus will be removed from Valdoria Palace immediately. The only question is whether this happens with the family's unified support or in spite of family objections. The ultimatum hung in the air like a sword. King Edward recognized the steel in his son's voice, the same steel that had made Alexander an effective prince and would make him a strong king. This was not a request or a negotiation, it was a declaration from a father protecting his child. After what felt like an eternity, King Edward spoke. Marcus, you will pack your belongings and leave Valdoria Palace by sunset today. You are hereby banned from entering the palace grounds or having any contact with Princess Isabella or any other children within the royal household. Elena gasped in shock, while Marcus's face flushed with rage. You can't be serious. This is my home too. This ceased to be your home the moment you threatened the safety of my granddaughter, King Edward replied with quiet authority. You will be provided with a residence outside the capital and a reasonable allowance, but your presence in the palace is no longer welcome. As the reality of the situation sank in, Marcus's composure completely shattered. This is all Alexander's doing. He's never accepted me, and now he's using his daughter as an excuse to get rid of me. Alexander stepped forward, his voice carrying the full weight of his royal authority. Marcus, you are absolutely correct. I am using my daughter as the reason to remove you from this palace. Because protecting innocent children from predators is exactly what a father and a future king should do. The confrontation concluded with Marcus being escorted from the throne room by palace security, his protests echoing through the corridors as he was taken to gather his belongings under supervision. Elena followed, torn between loyalty to her son and recognition that his behavior had crossed an unforgivable line. As the dust settled, King Edward and Alexander found themselves alone in the throne room that had witnessed so much history. The elderly king looked exhausted but resolute. "You handled this well, my son," he said quietly. "It was not an easy decision, but it was the right one. Isabella's safety must always come first." Alexander nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with difficult but necessary leadership decisions. "Thank you, Father. I know this wasn't easy for you either." As they prepared to leave the throne room, both men understood that this day had changed their family forever. But, sometimes, protecting the innocent required making difficult choices, regardless of the cost to family harmony or public perception. The important thing was that Isabella would sleep safely that night, and every night thereafter, in a palace where her security and innocence were valued above all else. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Marcus Thornfield was escorted through the ancient stone archways that had once welcomed him as a member of the royal family. Now, those same archways served as the exit through which he would leave in disgrace, his belongings hastily packed into several leather trunks under the watchful supervision of palace guards. Alexander observed from his study window, ensuring that the removal was conducted with efficiency and finality. Despite the gravity of the situation, he took no pleasure in witnessing Marcus's departure. This was not about revenge or personal satisfaction, it was about creating a safe environment for Isabella and sending a clear message that predatory behavior would never be tolerated within the royal household. Below in the courtyard, Elena stood beside the carriage that would take her son away from Valdoria Palace. Her usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, her face streaked with tears of anger and grief. She had spent the past several hours alternating between pleading with King Edward to reconsider his decision and raging against what she perceived as Alexander's orchestrated campaign against her son. "This is not over," Elena had declared during her final meeting with the king. "Marcus may have made some mistakes, but he does not deserve to be cast out like a common criminal. The royal family should stand together, not tear each other apart over misunderstandings." But King Edward had remained resolute. The professional assessment from Dr. Healy, combined with Sir James's testimony and Isabella's own account, painted a clear picture of predatory behavior that could not be ignored or minimized. The safety of his granddaughter took precedence over family harmony, regardless of the personal cost. As the carriage carrying Marcus disappeared beyond the palace gates, Alexander felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that Isabella would no longer be at risk from someone who should have protected her, and sadness that the family unity his father had worked so hard to maintain had been shattered by Marcus's actions. Isabella herself had been carefully shielded from the dramatic events unfolding around her. Dr. Healy had worked with Alexander and the palace staff to create a supportive environment where the young princess could begin to process her traumatic experience without being overwhelmed by the adult drama surrounding it. "Papa," Isabella had asked that morning, "is Marcus going away?" Alexander knelt to his daughter's eye level, choosing his words carefully. "Yes, sweetheart. Marcus won't be living in the palace anymore. He made some choices that weren't appropriate, and sometimes when people make bad choices, there are consequences." Isabella considered this with the serious expression she often wore when trying to understand complex adult situations. "Like when I broke Mama's vase and had to lose my dessert privileges for a week?" "Something like that," Alexander replied gently, but more serious. "The important thing is that you're safe, and you did nothing wrong. You were very brave to tell me what happened, and I'm proud of you for speaking up." Dr. Healy had emphasized the importance of reinforcing Isabella's sense of agency and self-worth. Children who experience inappropriate behavior from trusted adults often blame themselves or worry that they somehow caused the situation. It was crucial that Isabella understand she was the victim, not the cause, of Marcus's inappropriate behavior. Meanwhile, the palace staff buzzed with whispered conversations about the dramatic expulsion. Many of the long-serving employees had harbored private concerns about Marcus's behavior for months, but the strict hierarchy of royal protocol had prevented them from speaking openly about their observations. Mrs. Catherine Pemberton, the head housekeeper who had served the royal family for over 30 years, finally felt free to share her concerns with Alexander's personal aide. "I've been worried about that young man for some time," she confided. The way he looked at the young girls on the cleaning staff made me uncomfortable, but I didn't know how to address it without solid proof. Similar stories began to emerge from other staff members. The kitchen maid spoke of feeling uncomfortable when Marcus visited the kitchens late at night. The groundskeepers mentioned seeing him watching the children of staff members playing in the palace gardens with an intensity that seemed inappropriate. The stable hands recalled instances where he had made suggestive comments about young women in the nearby village. These revelations confirmed Alexander's worst fears. Marcus's inappropriate behavior toward Isabella had likely been part of a broader pattern of predatory conduct. The decision to remove him from the palace had not only protected Isabella but potentially prevented other victims from experiencing similar trauma. Sir James coordinated with the head of palace security to conduct a comprehensive review of all security footage from common areas over the past 6 months. While the private family quarters were not monitored out of respect for royal privacy, the public areas of the palace were under constant surveillance. The security review revealed several disturbing incidents that had previously been dismissed as harmless interactions. Footage showed Marcus engaging in inappropriate physical contact with young female staff members, including touching their shoulders and standing uncomfortably close during conversations. More troubling were instances where he was seen following young women through the palace corridors and lingering outside their quarters. One particularly disturbing piece of footage showed Marcus approaching a group of village children who had been invited to tour the palace gardens as part of a charitable event. The video captured him separating a young girl from the group and engaging her in private conversation while touching her hair and commenting on her appearance. The child's body language clearly indicated discomfort, but Marcus persisted until a palace guide intervened by redirecting the tour. This evidence would later prove crucial in justifying the royal family's decision to remove Marcus from the palace. It demonstrated that his behavior toward Isabella was not an isolated incident of poor judgment, but part of a concerning pattern of inappropriate conduct toward multiple vulnerable individuals. As news of Marcus's expulsion began to spread beyond the palace walls, Alexander prepared for the inevitable public relations challenges. The royal family's reputation had weathered many storms over the centuries, but accusations of covering up predatory behavior within their own ranks would be particularly damaging in the current social climate. Alexander convened an emergency meeting with the palace's communications team to develop a strategy for handling media inquiries and public speculation. The challenge was to provide enough information to demonstrate that the royal family took allegations of inappropriate behavior seriously, while protecting Isabella's privacy and avoiding details that could be traumatic for her to encounter in the media. "We need to be transparent about our commitment to child safety," advised Lady Margaret Sinclair, the palace's chief communications officer. "The public will respect decisive action to protect Princess Isabella, but they'll be skeptical if we appear to be covering up or minimizing the situation." Alexander agreed with this approach. "I want to make it clear that we acted swiftly and decisively based on credible evidence. This is not about family politics or personal disputes, it's about protecting children from predatory behavior." The official statement, carefully crafted and reviewed by legal counsel, was released that evening. The royal family of Valdoria confirms that Marcus Thornfield is no longer residing at Valdoria Palace due to behavior incompatible with royal values and family safety. This decision was made following a thorough investigation of allegations involving inappropriate conduct toward a minor family member. The royal family remains committed to maintaining the highest standards of conduct and protecting the welfare of all children within the royal household. The statement was deliberately brief but clear in its implications. It acknowledged the seriousness of the situation without providing sensational details that could further traumatize Isabella or compromise any potential legal proceedings. Public reaction was swift and generally supportive of the royal family's actions. In an era of increased awareness about child safety and sexual predators, the decisive removal of Marcus from the palace was viewed as appropriate and responsible leadership. However, not all reactions were positive. Some royal watchers criticized the family for what they perceived as harsh treatment of Marcus without due process. Elena's supporters argued that the young man was being scapegoated for behavior that could be attributed to adjustment difficulties and alcohol problems rather than predatory intentions. These criticisms were particularly painful for King Edward, who had genuinely hoped that his marriage to Elena would create a harmonious blended family. The failure of that dream weighed heavily on him, but he remained convinced that protecting Isabella had been the right choice. Elena herself struggled with conflicting emotions. As a mother, her instinct was to defend her son against what she saw as unfair accusations. But, as a member of the royal family, she understood the importance of protecting children and maintaining public trust. The internal conflict between these loyalties created a tension that would strain her marriage to King Edward for months to come. In quieter moments, when the palace had settled into its evening routines, Alexander often found himself reflecting on the broader implications of the day's events. The removal of Marcus represented more than just the expulsion of a problem family member. It was a statement about the values and priorities of the modern Valdorian monarchy. Throughout history, royal families had often prioritized political considerations and family unity over individual welfare. Scandals were covered up, victims were silenced, and perpetrators were protected to maintain the illusion of royal perfection. But Alexander's generation of royals understood that public trust in the monarchy depended on demonstrating real commitment to justice and child protection. We cannot ask our subjects to respect and support an institution that fails to protect its most vulnerable members, Alexander explained to his father during one of their private conversations. If we cannot keep our own children safe, how can we claim the moral authority to lead a kingdom? King Edward nodded thoughtfully. Despite his initial reluctance to take such drastic action, he recognized the wisdom in his son's approach. The monarchy's survival in the modern era depended on its ability to adapt to contemporary values while maintaining its traditional dignity and authority. As the first week following Marcus's expulsion drew to a close, life at Valdoria Palace began to settle into a new rhythm. Isabella, with the support of Dr. Healy and her loving family, showed remarkable resilience in processing her traumatic experience. She continued her studies, played in the gardens, and gradually returned to her cheerful, curious nature. The palace staff, relieved by Marcus's absence, began to share more openly about their previous concerns and observations. This created an opportunity for Alexander to implement new safety protocols and training programs to ensure that any future concerns about inappropriate behavior would be reported immediately and investigated thoroughly. Most importantly, the incident had strengthened the bond between Alexander and his daughter. Isabella had learned that she could trust her father to protect her, even when that protection required difficult and unpopular decisions. This lesson in standing up for what was right, regardless of family pressure or public opinion, would serve her well as she grew into her own role as a member of the royal family. The removal of Marcus Thornfield from Valdoria Palace marked the end of one chapter in the royal family's story and the beginning of another, one characterized by transparency, accountability, and an unwavering commitment to protecting the innocent from those who would harm them. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus Thornfield's dramatic departure from Valdoria Palace, but the ripples of that decision continued to spread through the kingdom's noble society and beyond. Alexander stood in his private study, reviewing intelligence reports from the kingdom's security service that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of Marcus's activities since his expulsion. The residence provided for Marcus in the countryside village of Millbrook had initially seemed like a reasonable solution, far enough from the palace to ensure Isabella's safety, but comfortable enough to maintain some dignity for Elena's son. However, what the royal family hadn't anticipated was Marcus's inability to accept responsibility for his actions or his determination to portray himself as the victim of a royal conspiracy. Within days of his arrival in Millbrook, Marcus had begun frequenting the village tavern, where he regaled anyone willing to listen with his version of events. According to Marcus's narrative, he was an innocent victim of Alexander's jealousy and political maneuvering, cast out of the royal family for the crime of being Elena's son rather than a natural-born member of the Valdorian dynasty. Prince Alexander has always resented my presence in the family, Marcus would tell his drinking companions, his voice thick with self-pity and alcohol. He manufactured this entire scandal to remove me from the line of succession and eliminate any threat to his position as heir. These stories found fertile ground among some of the kingdom's citizens who harbored Republican sentiments or simply enjoyed royal gossip. Rumors began to spread that the official statement about Marcus's expulsion had been deliberately vague to hide the truth about internal royal family politics. More concerning were reports that Marcus had begun approaching young women in the village with increasingly inappropriate behavior. The local constable had received several complaints about Marcus making unwanted advances toward teenage girls at village gatherings and following them through the countryside paths. Sarah Miller, the 18-year-old daughter of Millbrook's blacksmith, had been particularly troubled by Marcus's attention. She reported to the constable that Marcus had cornered her outside the village bakery, making comments about her beauty and suggesting that as a former member of the royal family, he could offer her opportunities for advancement if she would spend private time with him. He kept saying that I was special, that he could see qualities in me that other men wouldn't appreciate, Sarah told her father, who immediately reported the incident to local authorities. When I tried to leave, he grabbed my arm and said that girls who were smart knew how to keep certain conversations private. The language and behavior patterns were disturbingly familiar to anyone who had read Dr. Healy's assessment of Marcus's grooming techniques with Isabella. It appeared that removal from the palace had not deterred Marcus from seeking out vulnerable targets, it had simply changed his hunting ground. When these reports reached Alexander through the kingdom's intelligence network, he felt a familiar surge of protective rage. His decision to remove Marcus from the palace had been specifically designed to prevent exactly this type of behavior, but it seemed that Marcus was incapable of recognizing the seriousness of his actions or modifying his conduct accordingly. Alexander immediately convened a meeting with Sir James, the head of palace security, and his legal counsel to discuss the implications of Marcus's continued predatory behavior. The question was no longer just about protecting Isabella, but about the royal family's responsibility to protect other potential victims throughout the kingdom. Your Highness, the legal counsel advised, Marcus's behavior in Millbrook could potentially be grounds for criminal charges. If he's engaging in harassment and attempted coercion of young women, the local authorities have jurisdiction to investigate and prosecute. But Alexander was concerned about more than just legal technicalities. As the future king of Valdoria, he felt a moral obligation to ensure that Marcus's removal from the palace didn't simply transfer the danger to innocent villagers who had even fewer resources to protect themselves. I want a full investigation into Marcus's activities since leaving the palace, Alexander ordered. If he's targeting young women in Millbrook, I need to know the extent of his behavior and what steps we can take to protect potential victims. Sir James nodded grimly. I'll coordinate with local law enforcement and have our investigators gather evidence discreetly. If Marcus is indeed engaging in predatory behavior, we need documentation that will support criminal charges. Meanwhile, the situation was taking its toll on the royal family's internal dynamics. Elena had grown increasingly bitter and isolated since her son's expulsion, blaming Alexander for destroying her family and turning King Edward against Marcus. Her relationship with her husband had become strained as she struggled to balance her maternal loyalty with the growing evidence of her son's problematic behavior. During one particularly difficult family dinner, Elena confronted Alexander directly about the ongoing surveillance of Marcus. "You've destroyed my son's life," she accused, her voice trembling with emotion. "Now you're hunting him like a common criminal, trying to find evidence to justify your cruel treatment of him." Alexander maintained his composure despite the personal attack. "Elena, I take no pleasure in monitoring Marcus's activities. But, when reports surface that he may be threatening the safety of other young women, I cannot ignore them. My responsibility extends beyond just protecting Isabella." King Edward, caught between his wife's anguish and his son's unwavering commitment to child protection, found himself in an increasingly difficult position. He loved Elena and genuinely mourned the failure of their blended family, but he could not dispute the mounting evidence of Marcus's dangerous behavior. "Elena," King Edward said gently, "perhaps it's time to consider that Marcus needs professional help rather than our protection. His behavior patterns suggest deeper problems that won't be resolved by simply relocating him or making excuses for his actions." This suggestion only inflamed Elena's defensive instincts further. "He doesn't need professional help, he needs his family's support. Instead, he's been abandoned and vilified based on the complaints of a child who may not have understood innocent interactions." Alexander felt his patience finally beginning to fray. "Elena, Isabella is not a child who may not have understood. She is an intelligent, articulate 8-year-old who clearly described predatory behavior that was corroborated by an experienced palace guard and confirmed by a professional child psychologist. And, now, similar behavior patterns are emerging with other potential victims." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an urgent message from the village constable in Millbrook. Marcus had been arrested following an incident at the local harvest festival where he had allegedly attempted to lure a 14-year-old girl away from the public celebration with promises of royal connections and special opportunities. According to witnesses, Marcus had approached young Emma Thompson while she was helping her mother sell baked goods at the festival. He had positioned himself between Emma and her mother, engaging the teenager in conversation about her future plans and suggesting that he could introduce her to important people at court. When Emma's mother, Mrs. Alice Thompson, noticed her daughter's discomfort and tried to intervene, Marcus had become aggressive and demanding. He insisted that he was merely trying to help a promising young person and accused Mrs. Thompson of being narrow-minded about the opportunities he could provide. The situation escalated when Marcus grabbed Emma's wrist and attempted to lead her away from the family's stall, claiming he wanted to discuss her potential in private. Emma's frightened protests drew the attention of other villagers, and the constable was summoned when Marcus refused to release the girl despite multiple requests from her mother and bystanders. "This is the evidence we needed," Alexander told his advisors after reviewing the constable's report. Marcus's behavior has escalated from inappropriate comments and unwanted attention to attempted abduction of a minor. "This is no longer about family disputes or misunderstandings, this is about criminal behavior." The arrest of Marcus Thornfield on charges of attempted child endangerment sent shockwaves through the kingdom's noble society. For the first time in Valdorian history, a member of the royal family, even an adopted member, faced serious criminal charges for predatory behavior toward children. Elena's world crumbled as the reality of her son's actions became undeniable. The pattern of behavior was too consistent and too well documented to be dismissed as misunderstandings or malicious accusations. Her son, the child she had defended so fiercely, was indeed the predator that Alexander had identified. In a moment of devastating clarity, Elena recalled numerous incidents from Marcus's youth that she had dismissed or rationalized. His inappropriate interest in younger children during family gatherings, his tendency to seek out vulnerable individuals, and his skill at manipulating situations to his advantage, all of these warning signs had been present, but she had chosen to ignore them out of maternal love and loyalty. The psychological impact on Elena was severe. Dr. Healy, who had been monitoring the family's emotional well-being throughout the crisis, recognized that Elena was experiencing a profound crisis of identity and judgment. The woman who had prided herself on being a protective mother was forced to confront the fact that her protection had enabled harm to innocent children. "Elena needs support and counseling," Dr. Healy advised King Edward privately. "She's experiencing tremendous guilt and shame about her role in enabling Marcus's behavior. Without proper intervention, this could lead to severe depression or other mental health crises." King Edward, despite his own disappointment and anger about the situation, recognized that Elena was also a victim of Marcus's manipulation. Her maternal instincts had been weaponized against her better judgment, and she would need compassion and professional help to process the betrayal and guilt she was experiencing. Alexander, meanwhile, felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness as the criminal investigation proceeded. He had been correct in his assessment of Marcus as a danger to children, but he took no satisfaction in being proven right at the cost of additional victims and family trauma. The incident with Emma Thompson had been prevented from escalating to more serious abuse, but Alexander couldn't help but think about other potential victims who might not have been so fortunate. How many young women had Marcus approached inappropriately during his weeks in Millbrook? How many children might have suffered if he had been allowed to remain in positions of trust and authority? Isabella, now under the continued care of Dr. Healy, was carefully informed about Marcus's arrest in age-appropriate terms. The young princess demonstrated remarkable maturity in processing this information, expressing sadness that Marcus had continued to make bad choices while also feeling validated that her initial instincts about his behavior had been correct. "I'm sorry that Emma got scared like I did," Isabella told her father during one of their private conversations. "But I'm glad the police caught him before he hurt anyone worse." Alexander hugged his daughter tightly, marveling at her resilience and wisdom. "You helped protect Emma and other children by being brave enough to tell the truth about what happened to you. Sometimes doing the right thing is hard, but it's always worth it." As the criminal proceedings against Marcus began to move forward, Alexander reflected on the broader lessons of this traumatic experience. The royal family's handling of the situation would set important precedents for how institutions of power and privilege responded to allegations of abuse within their ranks. The old model of protecting the institution at the expense of victims was no longer sustainable in the modern era. Public trust in the monarchy depended on demonstrating genuine commitment to justice and child protection, even when that commitment required painful sacrifices and difficult decisions. The removal of Marcus Thornfield from Valdoria Palace had been just the beginning of a longer process of accountability and reform. Now, with criminal charges pending and additional victims identified, the royal family faced the challenge of supporting the legal system's pursuit of justice while rebuilding public trust in their commitment to protecting the innocent. For Alexander, the path forward was clear. The monarchy's survival and legitimacy depended on its willingness to put child safety above family loyalty, institutional protection, and political convenience. The alternative, a return to the old ways of silence and cover-ups, was simply unacceptable in the light of Isabella's courage and the suffering of Marcus's other victims. 6 months had passed since Marcus Thornfield's arrest at the Millbrook Harvest Festival, and the ancient halls of Valdoria's Royal Court of Justice had never witnessed a case quite like this one. Alexander sat in the gallery reserved for the royal family, his face a mask of composed dignity that concealed the emotional turmoil beneath. Today would bring the conclusion of a legal proceeding that had captivated the kingdom and forever changed the landscape of royal accountability. The trial of Marcus Thornfield had been conducted with meticulous attention to both legal procedure and public transparency. Judge Eleanor Blackthorne, the kingdom's most respected jurist, had insisted that the case be handled no differently than any other involving crimes against children, despite the defendant's former connection to the royal family. The evidence presented during the 3-week trial had been overwhelming and deeply disturbing. Prosecutor James Crawford had methodically documented a pattern of predatory behavior that spanned several years, beginning with Marcus's earliest days as a member of the royal household. The prosecution's case had been built around 3 primary categories of evidence: the documented incident with Princess Isabella, corroborated by Sir James Whitmore's testimony, and Dr. Healy's professional assessment, the security footage and witness statements from palace staff describing inappropriate behavior toward young female employees and visitors, and the escalating incidents in Millbrook, culminating in the attempted abduction of Emma Thompson. But, perhaps most damaging to Marcus's defense had been the testimony of additional victims who came forward as the trial proceeded. Young women who had previously been too intimidated or ashamed to report Marcus's behavior found the courage to speak publicly about their experiences. Lady Catherine Ashworth, a 19-year-old daughter of a minor noble family, testified that Marcus had cornered her during a royal reception 2 years earlier. She described how he had used his position as a royal family member to pressure her into private conversations, during which he made increasingly inappropriate comments about her physical development and suggested that she could benefit from his special mentorship. "He made me feel like I had no choice but to listen to him," Lady Catherine testified, her voice steady despite the obvious emotional difficulty of recounting her experience. "He kept saying that he could help advance my family's position at court, but only if I was willing to trust him completely and keep our conversations private." The pattern was eerily similar to Marcus's approach with Isabella and Emma Thompson: the use of his perceived authority and influence to isolate vulnerable targets, combined with manipulative language designed to make victims feel special and chosen while simultaneously establishing secrecy and control. Sarah Miller, the blacksmith's daughter from Millbrook, also testified about her encounters with Marcus following his expulsion from the palace. Her account of being cornered outside the village bakery and pressured to meet with Marcus privately provided crucial evidence of his continued predatory behavior even after being removed from positions of trust and authority. The defense, led by prominent barrister Sir Reginald Pembroke, had attempted to portray Marcus as a troubled young man whose behavior had been misinterpreted by those who never accepted his integration into the royal family. They argued that his comments and actions, while perhaps inappropriate, had never escalated to physical assault and, therefore, should be viewed as errors in judgment rather than criminal predation. But this strategy crumbled under the weight of Dr. Healy's expert testimony about grooming patterns and predatory behavior. The renowned child psychologist explained to the jury how Marcus's actions represented textbook examples of grooming techniques used by sexual predators to identify, isolate, and manipulate potential victims. "The defendant's behavior demonstrates classic escalation patterns," Dr. Healy testified. He began with boundary testing through inappropriate comments and unwanted physical contact, progressed to isolation techniques and manipulation through promises of special opportunities, and culminated in attempts at physical control and removal of victims from safe environments. She continued with devastating clinical precision. The consistency of these patterns across multiple victims and time periods indicates deliberate, calculated behavior rather than mere misunderstandings or social awkwardness. This is predatory conduct in its most recognizable form. The jury of 12 citizens, representing various social classes and backgrounds throughout Valdoria, deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with their verdict. The foreman, a middle-aged merchant named Thomas Hartwell, rose with obvious solemnity as he prepared to announce their decision. On the charge of attempted child endangerment in the first degree, he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, "We find the defendant, Marcus Thornfield, guilty." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery as the full implications of the verdict sank in. This was the first time in Valdorian history that someone connected to the royal family had been convicted of crimes against children, and the precedent would reverberate through the kingdom's legal and social structures for generations to come. On the charge of criminal harassment in the second degree, the foreman continued, "We find the defendant guilty." On the charge of attempted coercion of a minor, he concluded, "We find the defendant guilty." Judge Blackthorne accepted the verdict with the grave dignity befitting such a momentous occasion. "Marcus Thornfield," she addressed the defendant directly, "you have been found guilty of serious crimes against children by a jury of your peers. These crimes represent a fundamental violation of the trust placed in you as a member of a privileged family and a betrayal of the innocent victims who look to you for guidance and protection." The sentencing phase revealed the full scope of Marcus's predatory behavior and its impact on his victims. Victim impact statements were read by Isabella's representative, as she was deemed too young to testify directly, Emma Thompson and her family, Sarah Miller, Lady Catherine Ashworth, and several other young women who had been targeted by Marcus during his time in the royal household. Isabella's statement, carefully prepared with Dr. Healy's guidance and read by the court clerk, was particularly powerful. "Marcus made me feel scared and confused when I was just trying to read my favorite books. I didn't understand why he said those things to me or why he wouldn't let me go to my papa. I'm glad that other children won't have to feel scared like I did because the grown-ups listened to me and believed me." Judge Blackthorne sentenced Marcus to 8 years in prison, with the possibility of supervised release after serving a minimum of 5 years. The sentence also included mandatory participation in psychological counseling programs and lifetime prohibition from working with children or in positions of authority over vulnerable individuals. The court recognizes that the defendant's crimes were enabled by his position of privilege and trust, Judge Blackthorne stated during sentencing. This case serves as a reminder that no individual, regardless of their family connections or social status, is above the law when it comes to protecting children from predatory behavior. As Marcus was led away in shackles, his face finally showing some recognition of the gravity of his situation, Alexander felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and determination. Justice had been served, but at a tremendous cost to everyone involved. Elena had not attended the trial, having suffered a complete emotional breakdown when the full extent of Marcus's crimes became undeniable. She was currently residing in a private psychiatric facility, receiving intensive therapy to help her process the guilt, shame, and betrayal she felt about her role in enabling her son's behavior. King Edward, now approaching his 74th birthday, had aged visibly during the months of legal proceedings. The stress of watching his family torn apart by Marcus's actions had taken a significant toll on his health, though he remained steadfast in his support for Alexander's handling of the crisis. "You showed true leadership during this difficult time," King Edward told his son as they walked through the palace gardens following the trial's conclusion. Protecting Isabella and the other victims required courage and principle that many leaders would not have possessed. Alexander nodded thoughtfully, watching his daughter play with her governess near the fountain where she had once felt safe and carefree. "It was never about courage, father. It was about doing what any parent would do to protect their child. The tragedy is that it took so long for Marcus's victims to find someone who would listen to them and take action." The trial's conclusion marked the beginning of a new chapter for the royal family and the kingdom as a whole. Alexander had already begun implementing comprehensive reforms to prevent future incidents of abuse within royal institutions. New protocols required immediate reporting of any concerns about inappropriate behavior, mandatory training for all palace staff on recognizing signs of predatory conduct, and regular review of security procedures designed to protect vulnerable individuals. Most importantly, Alexander had established an independent ombudsman office specifically dedicated to investigating allegations of misconduct within royal institutions. This office would operate outside the traditional palace hierarchy, ensuring that future victims would have access to neutral authorities who could not be influenced by family loyalties or institutional pressure. Dr. Healy continued her work with Isabella, who had shown remarkable resilience throughout the ordeal. The young princess had become an inadvertent symbol of courage for speaking truth to power, and her recovery had been aided by the knowledge that her bravery had helped protect other children from similar harm. Isabella understands that what happened to her was wrong, but she also understands that her willingness to speak up made a difference, Dr. Healy reported to Alexander. She's developing a strong sense of personal agency and social responsibility that will serve her well as she grows into her royal duties. The public response to the trial's outcome had been overwhelmingly supportive of the royal family's handling of the situation. Citizens across Valdoria praised Alexander's decision to prioritize child safety over family loyalty, and many expressed increased confidence in the monarchy's commitment to justice and accountability. Editorial writers and social commentators noted that the case represented a watershed moment in the evolution of royal responsibility. For centuries, monarchies had survived by protecting their own interests above all else, but Alexander's generation had demonstrated that modern royalty could only maintain legitimacy by serving the broader interests of justice and child protection. 6 months after Marcus's sentencing, Isabella approached her 9th birthday with a renewed sense of security and confidence. The trauma of her encounter with Marcus had not been erased, but it had been transformed into wisdom and strength that would shape her character as she grew toward her own future responsibilities. Alexander often reflected on the lessons learned during the crisis. The most important revelation had been that true leadership sometimes required destroying the very thing you were trying to protect in order to preserve its essential values. The royal family had been torn apart by Marcus's expulsion and conviction, but its commitment to protecting children had been strengthened immeasurably. As he watched Isabella laugh and play in the palace gardens, surrounded by trusted staff who had been thoroughly vetted and trained in child protection protocols, Alexander felt a deep sense of satisfaction. His daughter would grow up in a safer world because adults had been willing to listen to her voice and take decisive action to protect her. The removal of Marcus Thornfield from Valdoria Palace had begun with a father's determination to protect his child. It had evolved into a kingdom-wide commitment to ensuring that no child would ever again suffer in silence while predators were protected by institutional loyalty or family privilege. In the end, Isabella's courage in speaking truth about her experience had not only saved her from further harm, it had fundamentally transformed how an entire society approached the protection of its most vulnerable members. That transformation would be Marcus Thornfield's most lasting legacy, though not in the way he could ever have imagined. The princess who had once cowered in a library corner, frightened and confused by an adult's inappropriate behavior, had become a catalyst for justice that would protect countless other children for generations to come. And her father, Prince Alexander, had proven that true royal leadership meant having the courage to do what was right, regardless of the personal or political cost.